Great. So the recording is on, and I will formally welcome you to Talking Data Equity for, I have to actually check my calendar for Friday, September 30th. And Talking Data Equity is an informal gathering that we do most Fridays at noon Eastern United States time. So that's Toronto time, New York City time. And it's an informal gathering of anybody who's trying to align their data work with their goals, their ideas, their values, the communities where the data lives and what the data is about. And sometimes we have special topics and sometimes we have special guests. And today we have a through the roof exciting special guest. I can't believe that he agreed to come, but let me introduce you in person, although I know a lot of you already know the work, to Yanni Loukissas. And Yanni, as most of you know, is the author of All Data Are Local. You can tell just by the title of that book that Yanni's all about many of the issues that we talk about. I don't know where you are right now in person, Yanni, but he is a professor at Georgia Tech, and he works in creative fields, helping anybody working with data understand the social implications of data and the technology that we use to work with that data. He has so many fascinating things on YouTube if you want to get more after this. Oh, I didn't know that the book was open access. So Yanni just put into the chat an open access. That's amazing. That's even more mind-blowingly cool. So let me not take up any more of your valuable time, and I will turn it over to Yanni. Thank you so much. I cannot over explain how excited we are that you're here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. This isn't a group that I was familiar with, so I'm very excited to learn about it and to hopefully return and participate in other sessions and see what else you all have going on. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, sitting behind a brick fireplace, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about my book, All Data Are Local. And then if people have questions or want to hear about more current projects, I can discuss, some of the things that are going on since the book. The book, as I put in the chat, is available open access now. It wasn't for the first 3 years that it was published, and now I had an agreement with MIT Press that they would open it up, and I just, my interest is in just sharing this with as many people as possible. So I hope you will take a look. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from with the book and share some slides. Let's see. Oh, can you enable screen sharing?
Yeah, sorry, I just fixed it. I'm on a travel laptop, so the settings are a little wonky. Does it work now?
Screen, yes, let's see.
Yay.
Okay, can people see that?
Yes, we can see, there we go. Yeah, now it's
okay. It's full screen. Okay, so the book is called All Data Are Local. The subtitle is Thinking Critically in a Data-Driven Society. This is a book that it took me a while to come to. I'm somebody who has kind of had a unconventional professional path. I actually started as an architect and then later studied computing and social research, and then became interested in data. I guess I would say rather recently, probably about 10 or so years ago, I started writing the book, and it was my attempt to bring together two areas of work that I was very interested in, and two areas of exploration. One, might think of as data visualization, which probably most people here are familiar with. It's data visualization is the way we present evidence graphically, and it's a design practice, and it can be a really exciting thing to engage with. As someone with a background in design, I think this was my first kind of way of engaging data, through visualization. And it was tremendously exciting for me to see the potential in that. I would say later on, after I had been working in data visualization for a while, I encountered another area of investigation that may be less known outside of university settings, called data studies. And data studies is an area of inquiry that attempts to reveal some of the assumptions and values that go into the creation of data. And quite frankly, those assumptions, those sometimes they're biases, those unspoken values often get overlooked and left out by visualization. So I thought, how can these fields learn from one another? How can visualizations be more equitable, be more just in their presentation of data by incorporating some of the findings and understandings of data studies? And then how can data studies benefit from design and visualization as a form of inquiry? And so I hope that resonates with you all, regardless of what area you might be coming from. My focus in the book and more generally in my current work is really on what I call public data, data in the public realm that's accessible, but also that deals with issues that concern us all, that issues relevant to the public good. And depending on where you are and whether you're in the United States or another country or in a city or a rural area, there's so much data these days about the places we live. And I think we need to find more just and more equitable ways of engaging with those data, of thinking about them, and filling some of the gaps that exist. So when just for some kind of historical context, I mentioned that I really started working on this book in 2012, and it was really another era. I think so much has happened since then. But one of the things that when I look back at that time, big data was really the focus of a lot of attention in university, but also in businesses, in government, in science. There was this sense of the unfettered potential of big data to really transform every domain of knowledge and practice. But I think we've learned a lot since then. And societally, data and algorithms have really entered the spotlight. Here are some stories, from around the time that the book came out. And so this kind of new public perception of data was emerging as I was writing the book. And as I was finishing it, this notion of big data's unfettered potential really seemed quite quaint. And the dangerous side to data, biases, absences, unanticipated impacts, blatant misuse, learning that data can be racist, data can be sexist, it can be simply fake. That and the examples, of course, run the gamut from election hacking to p-hacking, which if you're not familiar with p-hacking, it's a way of exaggerating the statistical significance of data. So how is the book gonna not just introduce these topics, but really show how we might respond to them in a practical way? And of course, the pandemic showed us that that these concerns were real, but also that we really need data to navigate things like the pandemic. So I think what has emerged in recent years is this sense that data might be flawed, but nevertheless they're vital to working together in our societies and making decisions both for our own good and for the good of our communities and of the broader public. So we're not really ready to give up on data as a way of knowing about the world, but I think we're a lot more mature. And so this is the question that has really kind of guided me in the book, and I think has served me well since publishing it, is really trying to answer, what does it mean to work effectively and ethically with data, particularly from unfamiliar sources? And I think this is something that, for me, as I began to work with data, I was coming at it, as I said, from the perspective of a designer, but also somebody who had been trained as an ethnographer, someone who had been trained to study other cultures, other social groups that I wasn't part of. So I was used to going in to new areas of knowledge and practice with what they call in Zen beginner's mind, not assuming that I understood how things work and being curious and open to learning. And data seemed like an incredible way to learn about new areas, new domains of knowledge, new ways of seeing, right? And so I brought with me some tools of what I might call an ethnographic stance. That's a term that comes from Sherry Ortner. This notion that in investigating different kinds of data, I was always a cultural outsider because I wasn't part of the shaping of those data. I didn't know what went into them. I didn't know the assumptions and values that they held. And this way of approaching data really builds on a long history of critiques of this notion of objectivity in science and technology, the idea that data are just there in the world and that they're just facts, when really I think it's more appropriate to think of them as cultural artifacts. They're made by people, and as I like to say, they're dutiful machines. And so, scholars from traditions like feminist theory and post-colonial studies have really done an amazing job in helping us understand how all forms of knowledge are situated. They're all created in a time and a place, by people who have bodies and histories. People like Sandra Harding, like Donna Haraway, like Anita Chan, who've all written powerful stuff. I think this comes from my background in architecture. I happen to be very interested in the relationship between data and place. And I'm interested in not just who makes data, but where data get made and why that matters. And so my argument is really summed up by the title of the book. Data are local because they are created by people in a time and a place with the tools at hand, working within organizations, and often for audiences that are prepared to receive them, to know how to interpret them. So just downloading some data off of the internet, just because we have access to data, either technically or legally, doesn't mean we have the tools to interpret them. And I think this is a mistake that we make over and over again. And I think one of the interesting things here, I use this term local. Often when people talk about local data, they actually mean data at a specific scale. They mean like data at the scale of a community, let's say. But local is a relative term. So local can be local to your computing network. It can be local to a neighborhood, of course. It can be local to a city, a county, a country. For people who study space, local means in our solar system. So, local, I think what's key here is that every data source has its own locality, its own scope. And it's really about difference. It's about who's inside and who's outside of this, this particular collection of data. So if we talk about something like the US Census, that's something that a lot of people are familiar with, even if they didn't, well, all of us participate in making the census, I guess, in some way, who live in the United States. But so that kind of data has a very different local scope or scale than, let's say, tax assessment data here in Atlanta, which I've used to look at, how the housing market is portrayed on sites like Zillow. So there are these different senses of what local can mean. So one of the examples I love to give to help people kind of jump right into this and see very concretely what I'm talking about is library data. Library data is fascinating. I have a whole chapter of the book about library data. And in particular, I write about the New York Public Library. This is one of the most well-resourced libraries in the United States. It has, I think, about 50 million objects, not just books, but photographs, newspapers. They even have, I think, Winnie the Pooh is part of their collection. They have all kinds of interesting objects. And of course, they have data on those objects to help them organize, manage, and distribute and keep tabs on all those objects. About 800,000 of them are in a digital collection, meaning that they're accessible digitally online. And I did this project. This is kind of early on in the book. I did this project with a student where her name is Michelle Partoghi, and we wanted to, we're working with this data from New York Public Library, and we are trying to put the objects from the New York Public Library onto a timeline. You can imagine that every object you would think would have a date associated with it, the date of its creation or publication. And so here's what we might think of as a date format or a date schema. And we need one of these for all of the objects, and they would need to be in a common format. There would need to be some kind of lowest common denominator we'd need to put everything onto one timeline. So we began to look at dates in the collection, and we quickly realized there was more than one format. And sometimes I like to ask, and I don't know if people have read the book and know the answer, but if people have guesses, and so this worked better before the book came out, but people would, I would say, how many formats do you think New York Public Library uses? And people would say 5, 10, 50 maybe. I don't think anyone ever guessed over 100. Well, we found 1,719 different date formats, different ways of writing the date. And if you zoom in on those, you start to see that they appear, very, it's understandable. Oh, okay, well, there's some Roman numerals. There's some approximations. There's some, sometimes the name of the printer is included there. Sometimes it's focused on the kind of reprint, or it's just a way of organizing things, but they're very human. And I think this really helps us gain a perspective of data as something that is a cultural artifact. It's really as much a cultural artifact as any of the books or other objects that the institution holds. And for me, this is so interesting because I think all of these problems or all of these discrepancies, as a data scientist might see them, are really wonderfully informative traces of the people, the moments, the conditions in which these data were made. And there's a lot of information here that could be too easily cleaned away. And when I looked at this the first time, I was reminded of this lovely book written by Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, years ago. She wrote this book called Purity and Danger, in which she tried to define dirt. And I think, maybe for any of you who have kids, small kids like me, I think this is like a persistent question about what constitutes dirt. And because the kids are really trying to figure that out. What can we bring in the house? So, leaves in the yard aren't necessarily dirt, but if you bring them into the house and, you scatter them all over the rug, suddenly they're dirt. And her point was that dirt is a rhetorical category, and dirt is a way of saying that something is out of place. And so I think when I look at this stuff and I think about what would be cleaned away here, in order to normalize this kind of data, to put it on a timeline, it's really stuff that is out of place. And by out of place, I mean that we don't have the context to understand why it's there, like this V, or other things that seem like what I've sometimes called data artifacts. And so maybe understanding data is about recreating or otherwise constructing a context that allows us to more accurately interpret what's going on here. And so I like to advise to my students and maybe anyone who will listen, don't just look at the data set, look at the data setting. So this kind of subtle shift from set to setting, I think, is key, because a set suggests something that's complete, that's closed, that's portable, that can be taken anywhere. Data are none of those things. Data are always entangled with the sites of their creation and use. Sandra Harding would say that they're part of a system of knowledge. And we have to understand that system as a whole before we can start to interpret the data. One of the ways I like to talk about data is, like if you look in the back of a book, like you have a thing like an index. Okay, well, an index is kind of like data. It tells you, it's wonderfully helpful. It tells you about different kinds of things that are in the book, where to access them. And on its own, actually, it's pretty interesting and useful. You can learn about, maybe the approximate length of the book, as well as what subjects it covers, but it's a hell of a lot more useful when you have the whole book, right? So thinking about the index and the book, I think, is a good analogy for thinking about the data and the data setting. So what is that broader context that we need to make sense of the data? And often that's other people and resources that can help us put it into this broader perspective. Okay, it's already 12:30. Maybe I'll pause there for a second. I wonder if there are any questions or let's see, I'm not seeing the chat. Do I have to?
I can see that you have to worry about monitoring the chat. I'll monitor the chat.
Okay.
And I'll just remind everyone that there's a couple of ways. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the chat, the Zoom chat. And if you want to make a comment to everyone, you can comment your question with the blue drop-down menu set to everybody in the meeting. If you want to ask a question, but you want to remain private, just direct message your question to me in the chat, and I'll ask it out loud. And if you're in the room and you want to raise your hand, go ahead and raise your hand and we will unmute you.
Yeah.
So
So
I don't, yeah, you go ahead. I don't think
I
there's
can
any questions right
continue.
now.
You
Yeah.
know, as my students will tell you, I can kind of go on for a while, but I want to make sure people can interrupt if they have questions. There are a couple topics that I
Yeah.
could talk about that I think this book sheds light on
Yeah.
and helps us understand. One is, I think it challenges our notion of what data are in the first place.
Yeah.
And this is something I really only started to grapple with actually after I finished the book. But this question of what do we mean by data? The next is this sense of this question of digital universalism. You know, I talk a lot about the local, and often we
Right.
think about the local in contrast to the universal. So
Yeah.
what's the problem with universalism? Like, universal design, isn't that a good thing? You know, it's making spaces more accessible. So I want to talk a little bit about that if we have time. And
Yeah.
then finally wrap up with some of the principles of locality as an approach to data. So let's dive into this first one. I read a book some time ago that was very influential for me called Big Data, Little Data, No Data by Christine Borgman. And she has this wonderful way of talking about data that kind of recalls Mary Douglas's conception of dirt, because for Borgman, data is a rhetorical category as much as dirt is. And she posits, and this is very much building on the work of Michael Buckland, who's one of her colleagues at UCLA. They introduced this notion that actually asking what are data is the wrong question. We should ask when are data, because anything can become data if we use it to make a claim or to support a claim. And she gives this wonderful example of, imagine you're visiting your parents and you're rooting through their attic and you come upon a box of old photographs. Those photographs aren't inherently data, but if you start making claims using those photographs, they become data. So you could make claims about past relationships in your family, about the clothing trends of the time, or even about the mechanics of the cameras used to take those photographs. And so, for Borgman, data are alleged evidence. It's when you make a claim and you use data, you're implicitly arguing that the data count as evidence. And that doesn't mean that they're true, or that they will be accepted as evidence, but it's something you are submitting. So I thought this was fascinating, the idea that in marking things as data, as in bringing them into a system of categorization, we are marking them as potential evidence for making claims. But I think it misses something. And I think it misses this notion that Bruno Latour, who is a sociologist of science and technology, introduced back in the 90s. That I think the notion that data are alleged evidence doesn't account for how data move around, because data move around a lot, right? I made the argument that data don't always work everywhere, or aren't always easily interpretable in new contexts, but we certainly move data around. And for Latour, that was actually the defining property of data. He calls data immutable mobiles. So basically things that are mobile, and they move and they don't change when you move them. And I think that's one of the principles of digital computing, that regardless of what kind of computer you have or who made it or what it's made out of, when you transfer data from one computer to another, they don't change. And so that data are, things that are combinable with other data, because you can bring data sources together, and then you can make these bigger and bigger claims, sometimes about places you've never been, you don't know anything about. So I like to say, though, to combine these two, to say data are allegedly mobile evidence. So they're kinds of evidence that we think can travel. And I think that's important. And I'm not arguing that data can't travel, but rather just that it takes a lot of work and an understanding of context and how to construct. Context isn't just something that happened to data in the past. It's really about how we present data, the story we tell around the data that helps people interpret it. And sometimes we construct that context from bits of information that are historical, but it really also has to do with the audience and you know, the interface for the data. And I get into that a lot in the chapter when I wrote about Zillow, the housing marketplace, and how housing data is contextualized for people who are shopping for houses. Okay. Against digital universalism. Well, I think there's something funny about the digital that I've been kind of interested in for a long time. And I think one of the places you can trace it back to is the work of this guy, Nicholas Negroponte. He was an architect who worked at MIT, and he later created the Media Lab, maybe some of you are familiar with, which is a famous research institute at MIT that produces a lot of cool media stuff. And he wrote this book in the 90s called Being Digital, where he speculated about what it was going to be like how culture was going to be transformed by digital media. And he wrote, being digital was going to mean less and less dependence upon being in a specific place at a specific time. So there's this kind of place agnosticism to a lot of digital media, this sense that it shouldn't matter who you are or where you are or when you are. We're all just users, and that we kind of have to get on board with what these digital platforms expect us to be. And I think that's an inherently problematic position, because I think what it does is it tries to erase the differences. I have some interesting example about that I want to share. Maybe I'll say something first before I get to that. So this is something that Anita Chan writes about in Networking Peripheries, this idea of digital universalism. And it's something that I really contend with directly in the book. And one of the things, I want to read you actually a little excerpt here from the book that will give you a sense of the tone of the book, but also some of the stakes, which I think, you know, sometimes when you look at some of this library data, it's like, okay, well, what's really at stake? So I write, the diversity and prosperity of the world's varied and contingent digital practices depend on our acceptance of data's locality. In fact, the stakes for the future of the internet couldn't be higher. If left unchallenged, digital universalism could become a new kind of colonialism in which practitioners at the periphery are made to conform to the expectations of a dominant technological culture. Learning to look at the local conditions of data can be a form of resistance to the ideology of digital universalism and threat of erasure it poses to myriad data cultures. So I want to give you you know, an example which kind of highlights that, but also teaches us not to romanticize the local, because the local, which the universal kind of arises out of, because digital universalism comes from this idea that some local conditions, let's say at the Media Lab at MIT or in Silicon Valley, should be applied or assumed to apply everywhere. And so, you know, this approach gives license to certain institutions to kind of apply their categories broadly, and ask us to conform to them. So here's another example of an institution. This is the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. It has data very much like the New York Public Library, and it has a lot of categories for managing that data. And I actually had a discussion with a now former curator at the Smithsonian, Maria McWhorter, who's an African-American woman, and she recounted this kind of harrowing experience of searching through the databases of the Smithsonian and looking for certain keywords. So she started by looking for Black, the keyword Black. And I worked with her to actually recreate this search on their website. And it worked better when I used the word Blackness. But what came up was a lot of artifacts tagged as Black or associated with Blackness as a cultural category, as a group of people, as artifacts associated with that culture, for McWhorter, there was this sense that Blackness existed in the archive as a definite and kind of highly categorized kind of area of culture within American society and American art. And then when she looked for white or whiteness, well, what came up? Well, paintings of white flowers, people whose name happens to be white, a white ship, a white mountain. So nothing about whiteness as a cultural category or a group of people. And the way McWhorter interpreted this was pretty stunning, and that's that Blackness is a category that's tracked and kind of followed throughout the Smithsonian, and whiteness or white culture is not. And that means essentially that white culture is the default. And something is only tagged racially when it doesn't conform to the default. So this is something that goes beyond what we might call bias. Here we can clearly see how data are shaped by invisible values and assumptions. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there's an implicit ideology of white supremacy in this data categorization system. And of course, we can only see this ideology through a kind of comparative analysis by seeing how data are created differently in one moment or one condition and another. And so this idea of comparative analysis is very important to how I understand data. And it really builds on Clifford Geertz's work on understanding the local. Geertz was an anthropologist, and he famously said, you can only understand one local condition in relationship to another. So often in order to see these local kind of conditions, whether they're just weird or harmful, you have to kind of see them in comparison. So I'll stop there. These kinds of explorations where I've engaged with people and data kind of simultaneously in these studies have led to these principles that I structure the book around. And I have various cases. So I talk about libraries and museums, but I also talk about things like arboreta. There's a very interesting arboretum in Boston called the Arnold Arboretum. It's been around for about 150 years. And there's some amazing stories about how data have transformed over time and what that can tell us about locality, and how data are shaped by a particular place. So it's one place that data have been made and remade, and sometimes unmade, and in the sense that they have kind of destroyed old data that are no longer understandable, or transferred data into a new format, from old ledgers to card catalogs to digital databases, and what happens in that process. Looking at the relationship between data and algorithms and how they shape one another through kind of co-creation. And I think there's some wonderful examples in the news to understand this relationship. And I write about Newscape, which is a database of broadcast news. And then the chapter on Zillow that I've mentioned a couple times, that is really about this notion of not just context in the sense of information from the time of data's creation, but context as a practice, as a way of presenting data. So sites like Zillow, this housing website, it extracts data from lots of different places and institutions, and then presents them in a way with certain goals, and uses certain algorithms to invite a certain kind of reading of those data. And so I would argue it's a recontextualization of data. They've decontextualized data from where they're made, like in the tax assessor's office, and then recontextualize them for this audience and for their own ends. Often I think that leads to problems. And I think in the case of Zillow, they have very much encouraged a kind of hyper exuberance around housing data, and a kind of this sense that the market is fluctuating, and the fear on the part of both homeowners and people who are looking to buy or rent that the market is changing every day, and that they have to be monitoring it all the time. And that's really a new idea. And I think it's something that Zillow maybe didn't invent, but they certainly have helped to get out there. And then, I have a chapter on this notion of data as indexes. I think the last thing I'll say before I see if there's some questions is just that, well, I think that thinking locally can be a form of thinking critically. And I think it's in parallel to this work. Sometimes we're told to think globally, but we also have to think locally. I want to mention, of course, that a lot of wonderful students have been involved in this work, and I want to acknowledge them. And often I'm thinking of my students when I write this kind of stuff. What do they need to know when they're encountering unfamiliar data? But I think for a broader audience, and I'd love to hear from you all about where you're coming from. But anyone who works or seeks to work with unfamiliar data, I want them to take away this message. As you seek to explore the world, data can be a wonderful starting point, an opportunity to get closer to the people and places beyond data. But do not mistake the availability of data as permission to remain at a distance.
Awesome end takeaway. And I think that you have a lot of resonance with almost everybody who's here today is really trying to figure out how to put this into practice. Because strong resonance in this community with, you can see in the chat, strong resonance. And for the folks who were here a few months ago, you might remember we had Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste, who is the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center and kind of the founder of Black feminist archaeology. She talked about a lot of similar things to Yanni. So one of the questions that's in the chat that's sent as a direct message to me is, do you have any recommendations for nonprofit organizations about how they might put this into practice in terms of the way that nonprofits collect, analyze, and visualize data? And I know you do, I think that you have some practical experience with the planning department. Anna, is that right? So I
Yeah.
know, so I'm wondering if you have any, like, when you approached the planning department in Atlanta, who aren't sitting around looking for what to do with all their spare money and their spare time, like, how did you speak their language to say, let's think about housing prices in Atlanta or something like that?
Um, so the so in terms of, just to kind of make sure that I understand the question, so what are the suggestions for how nonprofits can deal with data in a more equitable way? I have a bunch of recommendations in the book that I call kind of local practices that involve things like, of course, look at the data setting, not just the data set. Take a comparative approach to data analysis. One thing I'd like to suggest is challenge existing algorithms using counter data. So instead of accepting the data that exist and that maybe were created to because they fit well within existing algorithms of analysis and evaluation, question what those algorithms and those processes might leave out that you might collect. And there's a wonderful example of this in the work of grassroots map making through balloon photography, that the public labs have done. I'd also suggest that you look up the work of Adriana Garcia, who is a former student of mine who did her whole dissertation on how nonprofits can use data more effectively. I'll put her information in the chat. And
Yeah.
she's particularly interested in Twitter data and nonprofits that are seeking to use Twitter data and how they can think about Twitter data in this situated way. So instead of just looking at Twitter data on their own merits, really thinking about, okay, who are the communities that are tweeting and what is the broader context we have to understand to know the value of these tweets. So there's a lot of great work in that area. Yeah.
That's a fabulous suggestion. Yeah, so just a quick reminder that we will put the recording of this as well as the links to all the resources that Yanni is sharing and that other people are sharing in the chat in the We All Count data equity community. So if you're community forum. So if you're wondering what was that name of that person that you wanted to remember who has advice from nonprofits. Also, I think a really good example of this was Caitlin, who we had last week. Last week we had a journalist here who figured out that the gun violence data that was available for Missouri, especially around the time of the Ferguson events, wasn't locally situated, didn't reflect the lived experience of the people locally. And so she and her team went and actually collected their own data from people who were experiencing violence using their definition of violence. And so if you want to hear that whole story, that's also up last week, because I really think that we have a growing theme this fall in taking data out of the context where it was born and protect. And I love the idea of allegedly mobile, right? That we can just take it and standardize it or universalize it in an effort to make meaning for a lack of context. We often say, like, pretending that the data is a view from nowhere is a very problematic idea. I'm going to ask you one more question, and this is a funny question because you did mention the census, and I know some of you need to go because it's 5 to 1 in the East Coast. Adjust for whatever time zone you're in. So I will just quickly say that next week, because this connects to the question in the chat for Yanni, next week we have Kristen Powell, who's the deputy director of the Black Census Project. And so the Black Census Project is part of the Black Futures Lab. and they are collecting a national census that doesn't collect census data that centers whiteness, but collects census data that centers Blackness. So we're going to have her same time, same Zoom link next Friday. And that directly relates to the question, because you mentioned, Yanni, the census. And so the person is wondering in the chat, we are kind of forced to use census data. We're a health unit. Do you have any lifelines of help about how we can take existing census data and kind of relocalize it? Oh, great. And thank you.
Well, I just put in the chat.
Just put it in the chat.
This project called the Map Room, which is really about doing that. It's about putting data into dialogue with lived experiences. So it's a project that I have partnered with Jer Thorpe on. He's a digital artist, and it's basically a tool for making these very large scale maps, guided by a projector, but hand drawn. So the projector, just projects onto a very large sheet of paper, a base map from OpenStreetMaps. And then you can draw your experiences, like how do you get to work, or what are places that you hang out? Or we're actually doing a project now with middle school kids in Savannah around flooding, which is apropos. And it's so you can draw your own map of the place you live, showing things you care about, things you're worried about, and so forth. And then because it's guided by this projection, it will line up with any GIS data that you project on top of it. So you can project then census data, let's say, and then you can ask people to actually look at how the census data relate to what they have drawn and talk about where are their connections and where are their disjunctions. And I think this is also a way of reinforcing for people that they know more about the place they live than is in the data. And sometimes that knowledge is a complement to what's in the data. Sometimes it's in direct conflict. Some things, of course, they can learn from the data as well. It's not to say that the data are useless, but they are more, I think working with data effectively means having these dialogues where we put data into a conversation with other ways of knowing, that we don't expect the data to speak for themselves, and that our lived experiences can become data if we use them to make claims. I mean, that's what we learned from Christine Borgman. And the Map Room is one example of what I call an open data setting. And it's a place where we can make our own data, where we can kind of cast open this category of data and ask, what is going to count as data for us? So I wrote a paper about that recently. I could also put in the chat.
Awesome. I don't think that we could have a better sentence to end on than we're not going to get rid of data. We're not going to stop using data, but don't allow it to monopolize the conversation. Data needs to be in dialogue with lots of other sources of information, and even what gets to count as data is a cultural artifact. So we're gonna have to leave it there. I know that there are lots more questions that we could ask, and Yanni, I know you mentioned at the beginning you might be willing to come back again, so we will definitely be circling back to see if you can come back. And thank you so much for sharing the Map Room idea. Cool, can't wait to check that out. And really appreciate how much deep thinking you've done and giving examples to people who need examples to hand to decision makers to support changes that they want to make in what they're doing locally. And I know that you are a busy person who I think is technically on sabbatical. So thank you Yes, lots of appreciation in the chat.
Thank you all.
Thank you so, so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's really been nice. I'm just sorry that we can't be more together, but probably, this wouldn't be possible, so
Nope.
I hope yeah, I'll have more of an opportunity to hear from some of you all. Feel free to reach out, on email or Twitter or wherever. And I'd love to
Great.
hear, and if you have examples of how data are local for you and in your work, I would love hearing about those.
You will. This is a group that very much likes to share their experiences and examples, so you will hear them. And everybody who's still here, thank you for coming. We will hopefully see you next week to talk about the Black Census Project. And Yanni, thanks again. And everyone have a fabulous rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Yes, I am enjoying London. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Bye, Yanni.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.